The day Caroline James signed her name next to Robert Mason's, she told herself it meant nothing, just ink on paper, just a way to keep what was hers. She stood in the dusty office of Judge Hartley, wearing her dead father's ring on her right hand, and a plain gray dress that smelled faintly of cedar, and she did not cry. She had promised herself she wouldn't. Mason stood beside her like a fence post, straight, still, and impossible to read. He didn't look at her when the judge spoke. He didn't look at her when he signed. And when it was done, he put his hat back on, nodded once, and walked out into the cold Wyoming morning like he'd just settled a cattle deal. That was the agreement. Nothing more than a deal. Caroline needed a man's name beside hers to inherit the Willow Pine Ranch after her father died, without a will. A Mason needed. Well, no one in Ridgeback knew what Mason needed. He was the kind of man people talked about in low voices, the kind who rode alone, ate alone, and buried his past so deep even the ground didn't know what was down there. She had approached him on a Tuesday, laid out the terms like she was selling livestock, and he had looked at her for a long moment before saying, "This stays between us. You run your land, I run mine. We don't owe each other anything beyond that." She agreed without hesitating. They shook hands. Neither of them smiled. Before we go any further, if this story already has you hooked, you know what to do. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're new, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I read every single one. You're not just a viewer, you're part of this. So now let's get back to Caroline and Mason. Because what happens next? Trust me, you won't see it coming. Caroline James had grown up on Willow Pine Ranch the way most Wyoming children grew up, learning to work before she learned to rest. Her father, Elias James, was a quiet man with rough hands and a soft heart, and he had raised her alone after her mother passed from fever when Caroline was 6. She could rope a calf by the time she was 10, mend a fence line by 12, and read a storm coming in off the mountains better than most men twice her age. The ranch was everything Elias had built, and Caroline had poured herself into it right alongside him. When he died in late September, sudden, a bad heart, no warning, she had stood at his grave in the cold and felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Not just from grief, from the quiet, unterrible realization that everything he owned, by Wyoming law, would not pass cleanly to her without a fight. The county clerk had been polite about it, almost apologetic, but the words were the same no matter how gently they were delivered. Without a male co-signatory, the inheritance would be contested, tangled in legal process, and left vulnerable to outside claims. She had 3 weeks before the bank could move on the property. Caroline had spent the first week grieving, the second week planning. By the third week, she had walked across the eastern fence line to the one neighbor who kept to himself enough that she trusted he wouldn't turn her offer into gossip. Robert Mason had listened to every word she said without interrupting. Then he had asked just one question. "Why me?" She had looked him straight in the eye and said, "Because you don't talk." He had almost smiled. Almost. Robert Mason had not always been a man of silence. There was a time, years back before Ridgeback knew his name, when he had laughed easily and trusted freely. He had come to Wyoming from Missouri at 24, with a young wife named Clara, and enough hope to fill a grain silo. They had built a small homestead north of town, nothing grand, just honest land and honest work. Clara had a way of making even hard days feel light. She hummed while she cooked. She argued with him about everything, and was right about most of it. For 3 years, Mason had believed that was what life was. A good woman, good soil, and enough quiet to hear yourself think. Then one February, a fever swept through the valley. It took Clara in 11 days. A Mason had sat beside her bed every one of those 11 days and had not left her side once. When it was over, he buried her under the single oak tree on the north end of his property and did not speak to another person for 2 weeks. That was 7 years ago. Since then, Mason had expanded his land, improved his cattle stock, and built a reputation as a man who was fair in business and impossible in friendship. People in Ridgeback respected him the way they respected Winter, from a distance, without complaint. He had told himself that was enough, that land didn't leave, that cattle didn't lie. That silence was safer than anything warmth had ever offered him. So when Caroline James had stood at his fence line with her straight back and her dry eyes and her carefully worded proposal, and something in him had shifted just slightly, not toward her, not yet, but toward the strange and unfamiliar feeling of being needed by another person again. The first 2 weeks of the arrangement were exactly what both of them had agreed to: distant, practical, and quiet. Caroline kept to the willow pine side of the shared fence line. Mason kept to his. They had worked out the basics before the ink dried. He would appear at the bank with her when needed, sign whatever documents required his name, and show his face in town often enough to keep the arrangement believable. In return, Caroline would handle everything else alone. No shared meals, no unnecessary conversation, no pretending beyond what the law required. It was clean, sensible, the kind of agreement 2 reasonable people could honor without complications. And for 14 days, they did exactly that. It was a broken water pump that ended the distance. Caroline had been fighting it since Tuesday, a stubborn valve that kept the water from reaching the eastern trough where half her cattle drank. By Thursday evening, she had skinned 3 knuckles, wasted 2 hours, and was crouched in the dirt with a wrench in her hand when she heard boots behind her. She hadn't called for him, hadn't sent word. Mason had simply seen the problem from his fence line and come over without asking permission. He crouched beside her, studied the valve for a moment, then reached past her and turned it in the opposite direction. The water ran. Caroline stared at it. Then she looked at him. He stood up, wiped his hands on his trousers, and said, "It runs counter on that model." Then he walked back toward his property like it was nothing. Caroline watched him go and said nothing, but she didn't forget it. Small things had a way of adding up without permission. It started with the water pump. Then it was the morning Mason noticed her barn door had come off its upper hinge and fixed it before she woke up. Then it was Caroline leaving a covered plate of cornbread on his porch after she made too much. No note, no explanation, just food. He left the empty plate on her fence post the next morning, washed clean. Neither of them mentioned it, but neither of them stopped. By the end of October, there was a quiet rhythm to their days that hadn't been planned and couldn't be easily explained. Mason made strong coffee every morning and had started making enough for 2 without thinking about it. Caroline had started leaving her porch lamp on later than she needed to, not for any reason she was willing to name, just because the light felt right, and the town noticed before they did. Ridgeback was the kind of place where nothing moved without somebody watching, and people had begun to talk, not cruelly, just curiously. At the general store, old Mrs. Peck had told Caroline that Mason had turned down a hunting trip with the Aldridge brothers because he had things to attend to at home. Caroline had smiled politely and changed the subject, but she had thought about it all the way back to the ranch. That evening, she sat on her porch longer than usual, watching the last light drain out of the sky over the mountains, and she made herself ask the question she had been avoiding for weeks. What exactly was happening between them? She didn't have an answer, but for the first time since her father died, the silence around her didn't feel quite so heavy. His name was Decker Hale, and he rode into Ridgeback on a gray Thursday morning like he owned the road beneath him. He was tall, well-dressed for a man traveling through Wyoming. and he had the kind of smile that made people instinctively check their pockets. He was a land broker out of Cheyenne. That was what he told people. And he had heard about the Willow Pine Ranch through the county records office. A woman running a property that size alone, with a marriage arrangement that had no romantic history behind it. Decker Hale saw opportunity the way a vulture saw distance. He introduced himself to Caroline at the feed store on a Friday afternoon, hat in hand, voice smooth as river water. He told her Willow Pine was worth 3 times what she thought, that he had buyers who would pay generously, and that a woman of her intelligence deserved better than breaking her back over dry soil. Caroline had looked at him for a long moment, and then asked him to move aside so she could reach the grain sacks. He didn't give up easily. By the following week, Hale had made it his business to be wherever Caroline was, the post office, the market, the Sunday service she attended out of habit rather than devotion. He was never inappropriate, never aggressive, just persistently present in the way that certain men believed was charming. What he hadn't accounted for was Mason. On a Wednesday afternoon, Hale had approached Caroline outside the bank, just as Mason was coming down the steps. Mason had stopped. He hadn't raised his voice or made a scene. He had simply stood beside Caroline, looked at Hale with the kind of steady, unhurried gaze that made men reconsider their choices, and said, "She's not selling. And she's not alone." Hale had smiled thinly, tipped his hat, and walked away. Caroline had felt something shift in her chest that she was not ready to examine. Caroline didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the dark, listening to the wind move across the roof, and thought about what Mason had said outside the bank. She's not alone. 3 words. Simple enough. The kind of thing a man said to protect an arrangement, to keep up appearances, to make sure a land broker didn't find a crack in the agreement and wedge himself into it. That was all it was. That was what she told herself until about 2 in the morning, when she stopped pretending and admitted that the way he had stood beside her, not in front of her, not behind her, but beside her, had felt like something she hadn't felt since her father was alive, like someone was in her corner without being asked. She sat up, pulled her shawl around her shoulders, and made a decision that felt equal parts sensible and dangerous. She needed to pull back. Whatever was quietly growing between them was not part of the agreement, and she was not willing to let herself need someone who had only signed a piece of paper. She was cooler toward him the next 3 days. Polite, but distant. She stopped leaving the porch lamp on late. The cornbread stopped appearing on his fence post. Mason noticed. She could tell by the way he paused at the fence line one morning, coffee in hand, and looked toward her house for a moment longer than usual before turning back. He didn't push, didn't ask. He simply respected the distance she had reset, and somehow that made it worse. Because a man who honored her boundaries without complaint was far more dangerous to her heart than one who didn't. By the 4th day, she was exhausted from the effort of feeling less, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep it up. It was a fire that broke the wall completely. A small one, a dry patch of grass along Caroline's western fence line, caught a stray ember from a passing rider's pipe on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. It moved fast in the wind, low and hungry, chewing toward the older section of her barn, where she kept her winter feed. Caroline had seen it from the hill and was already running before she had time to think. She beat at it with a feed sack, stamping the edges, trying to keep it from spreading. But the wind kept shifting, and the grass kept feeding it, and she was losing ground fast. She didn't call for Mason. She hadn't planned to call for anyone. But when she looked up through the smoke, he was already there, moving along the far edge of the fire with a wet blanket, cutting off its path to the barn with the kind of calm, focused effort that came from a man who didn't panic. They worked together for 20 minutes without a single word, reading each other's movements the way people only could after months of quiet observation. When the last of it died in the dirt, Caroline